They say the fields remember the screams of Overseer Grady. He thought fear was a whip in his hand and a dog at his heel. Zachariah, a horse trainer with scars on his back and fire in his eyes, had no weapons, only patience and a dangerous kind of wisdom. While Grady beat men bloody and sent Brutus, the mastiff, to tear flesh for sport, Zachariah whispered, fed, and waited. Until one day, under the blazing sun, the master barked his order, and Brutus lunged not at the slave, but at the man who owned him. The overseer's body was left in tatters, his screams swallowed by the cotton rows. But what began as one man's vengeance lit a fire that could burn the whole plantation. Because once the master's dog chooses a new master, nothing will ever be the same. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The morning dew still clung to the grass as Zachariah ran a brush down the mare's flank. The stable smelled of hay and horse sweat, familiar scents that usually brought him comfort. But today, his muscles stayed tight, his eyes darting to the open stable door every few moments. Something in the air felt wrong. The horses sensed it too. The bay stallion in the far stall pawed nervously at the ground. Animals always knew when trouble was coming. Zachariah worked in silence, his movements careful and practiced. 20 years of training horses had taught him patience, when to push, when to back away, when to stay quiet. Outside voices grew louder. Zachariah paused, brush held mid-stroke. "Move faster, boy!" The sharp voice of Overseer Grady cut through the morning calm. "Water don't carry itself." Zachariah set down his brush and moved to the stable door. Through the gap, he saw young Caleb, no more than 8 years old, struggling with a bucket that was nearly half his size. Water sloshed over the sides with each step, soaking the boy's thin cotton shirt. Behind Caleb walked Grady, a thick leather whip curled in one hand. At his heel padded Brutus, the massive brown mastiff whose name alone made children cry at night. The dog's muscles rippled beneath his short coat, his eyes alert and watching. "I said faster!" Grady shouted. Caleb tried to quicken his pace, his skinny arms straining. The bucket tilted. Water spilled across the packed dirt of the yard. The boy stumbled, then fell to his knees, the bucket toppling beside him. Grady's face flushed dark with anger. "Worthless!" he spat, uncoiling his whip. "You need to be taught a lesson about wasting the master's water." Zachariah stepped out of the stable before he could think better of it. Other enslaved people froze in their morning tasks, eyes down, bodies tense. No one moved to help the boy. No one dared. Grady raised the whip high. Caleb covered his head with his arms, making himself small. "The boy's too young for that size bucket," Zachariah said, his voice steady, though his heart hammered in his chest. "He's trying his best." The yard went completely silent. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. Grady turned slowly, his pale eyes narrowing as they found Zachariah. "What did you say to me, boy?" Grady's voice was dangerously soft. Zachariah knew he should lower his eyes, back away, beg forgiveness, but something in him refused to bend this time. "I said he's just a child," Zachariah repeated. "Give him a smaller bucket or send him to other work." Laughter burst from Grady's mouth, ugly and sharp. "Well now, the horse trainer thinks he can tell me my business." He took 3 steps toward Zachariah, his boots kicking up dust. "You forget yourself." Behind him, Brutus growled low in his throat, massive head lowered, watching Zachariah with amber eyes. "I meant no disrespect," Zachariah said, though they both knew it was a lie. "On your knees," Grady ordered, pointing to the ground. Zachariah felt the eyes of everyone in the yard. Slowly, he knelt in the dirt. Grady's smile showed yellowed teeth. "You think you're special, don't you?" "Master's favorite with his horses." He circled Zachariah like a wolf. "But you're nothing. Same as this worthless boy. Same as all of you." He turned suddenly, gesturing to the others watching. "This is what happens when one of you forgets his place." Then to the dog, "Brutus, take him!" The mastiff tensed, powerful muscles coiling. For just a moment, so brief Zachariah almost missed it, the dog hesitated, his eyes meeting Zachariah's. Then Brutus lunged. Pain exploded across Zachariah's shoulder as powerful jaws clamped down. He fell backward, the weight of the dog driving him into the dirt. Hot breath and teeth tore at his flesh. Zachariah tried not to scream, but the sound ripped from his throat anyway. Through the haze of pain, he heard laughter. Grady's voice, "That's enough, boy. That's enough for now." A sharp whistle, and suddenly the weight lifted. Brutus backed away, blood, Zachariah's blood, dripping from his jaws. The dog didn't growl or bark. He simply watched, something unreadable in those amber eyes. "Let that be a lesson," Grady announced to the yard. "Next time, I'll let him finish the job." Zachariah lay in the dirt, blood soaking through his torn shirt. The pain came in waves, hot and sharp. But through it all, a strange clarity filled his mind. He looked at Brutus, standing obediently at Grady's side, the dog that had just torn his flesh, the weapon used against them all. And Zachariah saw something no one else noticed, doubt in the animal's eyes, hesitation before the attack. That night, in the cramped quarters, Dinah pressed a wet cloth to Zachariah's mangled shoulder. The firelight cast long shadows across the walls, making giants of them all. "You shouldn't have spoken up," Dinah whispered, her gentle hands at odds with the worry in her voice. "Grady's been looking for a reason to hurt you." Zachariah said nothing, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. Around them, others whispered. They'd seen Grady mark men before. They knew what usually followed. "He'll kill you next time," Jonas said from across the room. "You know that, don't you?" Still, Zachariah remained silent. Dinah dipped the cloth in water again, wringing it out. Blood tinged the bowl pink. "What were you thinking?" she asked softly. "That boy wasn't your concern." "He's all our concern," Zachariah finally said, his voice rough with pain. The fire crackled, sparks rising toward the ceiling. Zachariah watched them burn bright, then fade to nothing. But in his mind, he saw different flames, larger ones. He saw Brutus's eyes, that moment of hesitation. He saw the mastiff's powerful jaws, jaws that could just as easily close around Grady's throat as his own. He stared into the fire and felt something shift inside him. The pain in his shoulder seemed to burn away, leaving behind something harder, colder. They'd made him bleed today, but blood could feed flames just as well as oil. Dawn broke harsh and unforgiving as Zachariah made his way to the stables. Each step sent fresh pain through his shoulder. The bite wounds had barely closed, and dried blood still crusted his bandages. "Move faster!" Grady shouted from the porch of the overseer's cabin. "Those horses don't feed themselves." Zachariah kept his eyes down, his pace steady despite the pain. He could feel Grady watching him, waiting for any excuse to finish what Brutus had started. The stable door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, the horses nickered softly, recognizing him even in his weakened state. The bay stallion stretched his neck over the stall door, nostrils flaring. "I know," Zachariah whispered, patting the horse's nose. "I smell like blood. Don't worry." As he reached for a pitchfork, movement near the stable entrance caught his eye. Brutus stood in the doorway, his massive head lowered, watching. Zachariah froze. The mastiff's amber eyes seemed to study him, but the dog made no move to attack. Grady's voice called from outside. "Brutus, keep an eye on him." The dog's ears twitched at his master's command. He padded into the stable and settled on a pile of hay, eyes never leaving Zachariah. Carefully, Zachariah began his work. He moved slowly, filling feed buckets with oats, his injured arm held close to his body. The pain made his head swim, but he couldn't afford to show weakness, not with Brutus watching. When he finished feeding the horses, Zachariah reached into his pocket. He'd saved a piece of cornbread from last night's meager meal. Breaking off a small chunk, he held it in his palm and turned toward the dog. "Hungry, boy?" he asked softly, keeping his voice calm and low, the same tone he used with skittish colts. Brutus raised his head, suddenly alert. His eyes darted between Zachariah's face and the food. "It's all right," Zachariah murmured. "Just between us." He placed the cornbread on the ground halfway between them and backed away. Brutus remained still, suspicious. But after Zachariah returned to his work, the dog crept forward and sniffed the offering. A moment later, it disappeared into his mouth. The next morning followed the same pattern. Zachariah worked while Brutus watched. This time, he'd managed to save a small piece of salt pork. When he was certain no one was near, he placed it on the ground. "Good boy," he whispered, as Brutus took the food. "That's right." The dog didn't wag his tail or show any sign of friendliness, but he didn't growl either. It was a start. On the third day, Brutus entered the stable before Zachariah arrived. The dog was waiting, his eyes tracking Zachariah's movements with what seemed almost like anticipation rather than hostility. "You're early today," Zachariah said quietly, slipping the dog a piece of chicken he'd risked stealing from the kitchen. This time, Brutus took it directly from his outstretched hand, careful not to touch skin with tooth. Days passed. Zachariah spoke constantly to the dog when they were alone, his voice gentle, using the same patient tones that had calmed the wildest horses. He never gave commands like Grady did. Instead, he spoke to Brutus, as if the dog understood every word. "You weren't born mean," he told the mastiff as he brushed the horses. "He made you that way, just like he tries to make us all mean or broken." Brutus listened, head tilted, eyes always watching. On the fifth evening, Dinah cornered Zachariah behind the quarters as he was returning from the stables. "I've seen what you're doing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "With the overseer's dog." Zachariah stiffened. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't lie to me." Dinah's eyes were wide with fear. "Jonas saw you feeding him. What are you thinking? If Grady catches you—" "He won't. He will," she insisted. "And when he does, he won't just let Brutus bite you. He'll have you hung from that oak tree. Or worse." Zachariah looked past her to where the others sat around small fires, eating their evening meals, heads bowed, spirits broken. "Maybe that's better than this," he said softly. Dinah grabbed his good arm. "Don't talk like that. We survive. That's what we do." "Is this surviving?" Zachariah asked, "kneeling in the dirt while they beat children? Watching our people die slow every day? I'd rather die fighting. And what can you do? One man against whips and guns?" Zachariah didn't answer, but in his mind he saw Brutus's powerful jaws, teeth that could crush bone. "Promise me you'll stop," Dinah pleaded. "I can't promise that," he said simply. The next morning, Zachariah noticed Brutus was limping slightly. When Grady wasn't looking, he examined the dog's paw and found a thorn embedded deep in the pad. "This will hurt," he whispered, carefully working the thorn free with his fingers. Brutus didn't snap or growl. He stood perfectly still, allowing Zachariah to tend to him. When the thorn was out, the dog licked Zachariah's hand once, a brief, warm touch. That evening, as twilight painted the sky purple, Zachariah left the stables later than usual. His shoulder throbbed less now, healing despite the daily labor. As he walked toward the slave quarters, he heard the soft pad of paws behind him. He turned. Brutus stood there, ears forward, watching him. "Go on back," Zachariah said softly. "He'll be looking for you." But the dog didn't leave. Instead, he followed, keeping a few paces behind as Zachariah walked. They moved together through the gathering darkness, past the empty fields, toward the dim lights of the quarters. Zachariah's heart pounded. If anyone saw Brutus following him like this, questions would be asked, suspicions raised, but he couldn't bring himself to chase the dog away. At the edge of the quarters, where the dirt path met the packed earth of the common area, Zachariah finally stopped. He knelt, bringing himself to eye level with the mastiff. "You need to go back now," he said firmly. Brutus stared at him, something like understanding in those amber eyes. Then, after a long moment, the dog turned and trotted back toward the main house. Zachariah watched him go, a strange mix of hope and fear stirring in his chest. The dog that had torn his flesh now followed at his heels. The weapon was beginning to turn. It was dangerous, more dangerous than anything he'd ever done. But as he stood at the edge of the quarters, watching Brutus's form disappear into the gathering darkness, Zachariah felt something he hadn't felt in years: power. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the cotton field. Heat rose in shimmering waves from the ground, turning the air thick and hard to breathe. Rows of enslaved people bent over the plants, fingers bloodied from the sharp cotton bolls, backs aching from hours stooped beneath the burning sky. Sweat-soaked shirts clung to skin, and parched throats begged for water that wouldn't come until the overseer called break time. Zachariah worked his way down a row, his injured shoulder still stiff but healing. The puncture wounds from Brutus's teeth had closed into ugly red scars that pulled with every movement. He kept his head down, fingers moving steadily, plucking the white bowls and dropping them into his sack. From the edge of the field, Overseer Grady watched, tapping his coiled whip against his leg. Brutus sat beside him, panting in the heat, but his eyes followed Zachariah's movements. The dog had grown leaner in the past week, refusing food from Grady's hand, accepting it only from Zachariah in the early mornings when they were alone. "Move faster!" Grady shouted across the field. "Anyone not meeting their quota gets the whip tonight." The workers bent lower, fingers moving more desperately. A young woman named Sarah stumbled 2 rows over from Zachariah. Her pregnant belly made it difficult to bend, and she'd been working since before dawn. As she straightened to stretch her aching back, her basket tipped, spilling some cotton onto the ground. Grady's eyes narrowed. "You!" he shouted, pointing at Sarah. "Pick that up and get back to work." "Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she struggled to kneel down. "Too slow!" Grady stormed across the field, whip raised. "You lazy!" The crack of leather split the air as the whip came down across Sarah's shoulders. She cried out, falling to her knees. "Stop!" Zachariah said, the word escaping before he could think better of it. The field went silent. Faces turned, eyes wide with fear and disbelief. No one spoke to Grady that way. No one. The overseer turned slowly, his face red with rage and heat. "What did you say to me, boy?" Zachariah stood straight, his sack of cotton dropping to the ground. "She's with child. She needs water." Grady's face twisted into an ugly smile. "Well, well, seems you didn't learn your lesson the first time." He turned to the others. "Gather around. You're all about to see what happens when a slave forgets his place." The workers shuffled reluctantly into a circle, fear etched on every face. Some couldn't bear to watch, keeping their eyes fixed on the ground. "Come here," Grady ordered Zachariah, uncoiling his whip. Zachariah stepped forward, his heart hammering in his chest. He had known this moment would come, had been preparing for it since that first day when Brutus had attacked him. His eyes found the dog, sitting alert at Grady's side. "Brutus," Grady said, voice thick with anticipation. "Tear him apart." The mastiff rose to his feet, muscles rippling beneath his short coat. For a moment, he didn't move. His amber eyes locked with Zachariah's. "Attack!" Grady shouted, pointing at Zachariah. Brutus growled deep in his throat. But instead of lunging at Zachariah, he turned his massive head toward Grady, lips peeling back to reveal sharp teeth. "What the—" Grady began. The mastiff launched himself not at Zachariah, but at Grady. 200 pounds of muscle and bone slammed into the overseer's chest, knocking him flat on his back. Brutus's jaws closed around Grady's throat before the man could even scream. Blood sprayed across the white cotton bowls. Grady's arms flailed, trying to push the dog away, but Brutus was relentless. His teeth tore through flesh, shaking his head from side to side like he was killing prey. The enslaved people scattered backward, some crying out in terror, others watching in stunned silence. A woman covered her child's eyes. An old man fell to his knees, praying in hushed tones. Grady's screams gurgled to silence as his windpipe collapsed beneath Brutus's jaws. His legs kicked once, twice, then went still. But Brutus didn't stop. He continued to tear and shake, blood darkening his muzzle, splashing onto the ground, staining the cotton a deep crimson. "Brutus," Zachariah called softly. "Enough." The dog's head snapped up, eyes finding Zachariah's. Blood dripped from his jaws, and pieces of Grady's flesh hung from his teeth. But at Zachariah's voice, the rage seemed to drain from him. He stepped off the overseer's body and padded to Zachariah's side, pressing against his leg like a loyal hound. No one moved. The only sound was the buzz of flies already gathering on Grady's corpse and the distant call of a crow. The sun continued to beat down, indifferent to the violence that had just unfolded. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice trembling. "They'll kill us all for this." Murmurs rippled through the group. Some nodded in agreement, fear plain on their faces. Others looked at Zachariah with something close to awe. "What have you done?" Jonas, the cook, whispered. "Master will hang every one of us when he finds out." "He turned that dog against its master," an old man said, crossing himself. "Like the devil himself." "Not the devil," Dinah said quietly, stepping forward to stand beside Zachariah. "Just a man who refused to be treated like an animal." Zachariah looked down at Brutus, still pressed against his leg, blood drying on his fur. The dog that had been trained to hunt and kill them was now their defender. The weapon had turned against its wielder. He raised his eyes to the gathered faces, seeing the mixture of fear, hope, and uncertainty reflected there. This single act, this moment of rebellion, would change everything. There was no going back now. The master would indeed seek vengeance. The patrols would come with guns and more dogs. Some might be beaten for information, others hanged as examples. But as he stood there in the blood-soaked field, Brutus at his side, Zachariah also saw something else flickering in the eyes of his people, a dangerous, fragile spark that had not been there before, the spark of possibility. Sunset painted the sky blood-red as Mr. Whitfield's carriage rolled up the long drive to the plantation house. Behind it came 3 wagons filled with armed men, the county patrol, summoned by messenger as soon as news of Grady's death reached the main house. Their rifles gleamed in the fading light, and several had brought hunting dogs that strained at their leashes, eager for the scent of prey. The enslaved people had been herded into the yard like cattle, forced to stand in neat rows facing the main house. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, too frightened to cry. Old men and women leaned on each other for support, their faces carved with the weary lines of those who had seen such scenes before and knew what was coming. In the center of the yard lay Grady's body, covered with a sheet that had once been white, but was now stained rust-brown with dried blood. Flies buzzed around it in thick clouds, drawn by the smell of death that hung heavy in the humid evening air. Zachariah stood in the back row, his face carefully blank. Brutus was nowhere to be seen. He had ordered the dog to stay hidden in the woods beyond the cotton field. Beside him, Dinah stood straight and still, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the horror before them. The door to the main house swung open, and Mr. Whitfield descended the steps. Unlike Grady, who had been all swagger and noise, Whitfield moved with the quiet precision of a man who knew his power needed no announcement. His fine suit was unwrinkled despite the heat, his white hair neatly combed back from a forehead creased with cold fury. "Uncover him," Whitfield ordered, gesturing to Grady's corpse. One of the patrolmen stepped forward and yanked away the sheet. A collective gasp rippled through the assembled slaves. In death, Grady looked small, his throat torn open in a ragged wound that revealed bone and gristle. His eyes stared sightlessly at the darkening sky, and his skin had taken on the waxy pallor of a day-old corpse. Whitfield surveyed the gruesome sight without flinching, then raised his eyes to the rows of people before him. "This," he said, his voice carrying easily across the yard, "is what happens when order is disturbed on my plantation." He clasped his hands behind his back and began to pace slowly before the front row. "My overseer, my property, destroyed like an animal, and not by any natural cause, but by human hands." A murmur of protest rose from the slaves. It had been Brutus who killed Grady, not human hands, but Whitfield silenced them with a sharp look. "The dog was merely the weapon," he continued, as if reading their thoughts. "Someone turned that animal against its master, someone who will pay dearly for this act of rebellion." He stopped pacing and turned to face them fully. "I am a reasonable man," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous softness. "I provide food, shelter, clothing. In return, I expect only your labor and your obedience. Is that so much to ask?" No one dared answer. "Now I find myself with a problem," Whitfield continued. "An overseer dead, and a murderer hiding among you." His cold eyes swept the rows. "Unless the guilty party steps forward immediately, I will be forced to assume you are all complicit." Jonas, the cook, shifted nervously beside Zachariah. His eyes darted sideways, meeting Zachariah's for the briefest moment before looking away. "Collective punishment will begin at dawn," Whitfield announced. "No food rations for 3 days. 20 lashes for any man found outside the quarters after dark. And if the guilty party is not delivered to me by tomorrow evening—" He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. "I will select 5 of you at random for hanging." A soft cry escaped from someone in the crowd. A child began to sob. "The patrols will search the swamps tonight," Whitfield continued, gesturing to the armed men behind him. "Any slave found hiding or running will be shot on sight. Any slave found aiding the murderer will be executed alongside him." Jonas leaned slightly toward Zachariah, his voice barely a whisper. "They'll hang us all because of what you did. One man's pride ain't worth all our lives." Dinah stood on Zachariah's other side, her spine straight as an iron rod. She didn't speak, but her hand found his in the gathering darkness, squeezing once before letting go. In that brief touch was a message clearer than words. She would not betray him, even if it meant her death. "Return to your quarters," Whitfield ordered. "Dawn comes early, and there is cotton to be picked, overseer or no." As the slaves filed back toward the cabins, the patrol leader approached Whitfield. "We'll need dogs to track in the swamp, sir." "Good ones. Take what you need," Whitfield replied, "but I want that man alive. His death will be public and slow, a lesson no one on this plantation will ever forget." Night fell fully as the enslaved people returned to their quarters. The patrol divided into groups, lighting torches and leading dogs toward the edges of the plantation where dark swampland began. Their voices carried on the night air, calling to each other as they spread out to begin the hunt. Inside the cramped cabin she shared with 3 other women, Dinah moved to the small window, peering out at the darkness. Torchlight flickered in the distance as the patrol disappeared into the trees. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her face remained composed, betraying nothing of the fear that churned inside her. In the men's quarters, Jonas paced nervously, muttering prayers under his breath. "Lord, save us all." he whispered. "One man's fight ain't worth all our blood." Zachariah waited until the last patrol had vanished into the trees. Then, silent as a shadow, he slipped from his pallet and out through the back of the quarters where a loose board had long ago been worked free. He paused in the darkness, whistling once, a soft, low sound that might have been a night bird. From the edge of the woods, Brutus emerged, a darker shadow against the night. Blood still matted his fur, but his eyes gleamed with intelligence as he padded to Zachariah's side. Man and dog exchanged a look of perfect understanding. Then, together, they melted into the darkness, heading not away from the plantation, but deeper into the heart of the swamp, where the water ran black, and the cypress trees grew thick enough to hide a man and his dog from even the keenest eyes. In her window, Dinah watched them go, her fingers pressed against the rough wood of the sill. She knew he was both her greatest hope and her greatest danger. If he were caught, they would all suffer. If he succeeded in whatever plan was forming in his mind, perhaps something might change. But as she watched the darkness swallow him, she couldn't help wondering if she would ever see him again. Dawn broke gray and heavy with mist over the swamp. Zachariah crouched low in the reeds, his body sore and stiff from a night spent wading through black water and thick mud. Beside him, Brutus lay panting, his massive frame splattered with drying muck. Both man and dog were covered in mosquito bites, the insects drawn to their warmth and blood in the damp morning air. In the distance, the baying of hounds echoed across the water. The sound made Brutus's ears prick up, but a gentle hand on his back kept him still and silent. "Easy now," Zachariah whispered, his voice barely audible even to the dog. "They're hunting us, but this swamp knows me better than it knows them." He had spent years slipping away to these wetlands whenever he could steal an hour, learning its paths and secrets. The overseers had always thought him fishing, and he did bring back fish to maintain the story. But what he had really been seeking was knowledge. Knowledge of a place where men with whips feared to tread too deeply. The patrol's dogs howled again, closer now, but still following a false trail Zachariah had laid the night before, dragging a piece of his shirt through muddy water before doubling back and climbing a cypress to cross to another tree. His stomach cramped with hunger. He hadn't eaten since before Grady's death, and the small package of cornbread he'd managed to grab before fleeing was long gone. Brutus whined softly, sensing his discomfort. "I know, boy. We need to eat." Zachariah peered through the reeds at the still water nearby. "Let's see what the swamp can give us." With practiced movements, he pulled a thin, sharpened stick from his belt, a makeshift spear he'd crafted during the night. He crept to the water's edge, signaling Brutus to stay behind. The dog obeyed, watching intently as Zachariah stood perfectly still, spear poised. Minutes passed. The patrol dogs grew quieter, moving in the wrong direction. A ripple disturbed the water's surface. Zachariah's arm moved in a swift, sure motion, and the spear plunged beneath the surface. When he lifted it, a fat catfish writhed on the end. "There's breakfast," he murmured to Brutus, who padded forward eagerly. Using a sharp stone, Zachariah gutted the fish, giving the innards to Brutus, who gulped them down hungrily. The raw flesh was slimy and bland, but Zachariah ate without complaint, knowing he needed the strength. Afterward, he dug in the soft earth near the water's edge, finding thick, starchy roots that tasted bitter, but would keep hunger at bay. As the sun climbed higher, they moved deeper into the swamp, always listening for the sounds of pursuit. Zachariah taught Brutus to walk on the fallen logs and stones to leave fewer tracks, and to swim silently beside him when they had to cross open water. "You're smarter than they ever knew," he told the dog, as they rested in the shade of a massive cypress. "Grady never saw what you could be. He just wanted a weapon." He stroked the dog's scarred muzzle. "We're both more than what they made us for." Brutus pressed his head against Zachariah's hand, eyes alert but trusting. By mid-afternoon, The patrol sounds had faded entirely. Zachariah found a small island of relatively dry land nestled between cypress knees and covered with thick moss. There they finally slept, taking turns keeping watch, man sleeping while dog sat guard. Then Zachariah watching over Brutus as the big animal snored softly in exhaustion. Back on the plantation, the sun beat down mercilessly on the cotton fields. With Grady gone, Whitfield had appointed a temporary overseer, a wiry, red-headed man named Hobbs, who had little experience but great enthusiasm for the whip. "Faster!" Hobbs shouted, cracking the whip near Dinah's feet as she bent to pick cotton, her fingers bleeding from the sharp bowls. "Mr. Whitfield wants this field cleared by sundown." The absence of food rations had already weakened many. An old man collapsed in the next row, and Hobbs ordered 2 men to drag him back to the quarters without a drop of water. "Anyone else feeling faint?" Hobbs challenged, eyeing the rows of bent backs. "Maybe a taste of the whip will wake you up." In the kitchen house, Jonas stirred a pot of watery gruel, meant only for the house slaves and overseers. His own children, assigned to the fields despite their young age, would go hungry like the rest. His hands shook with anger and fear as he worked. "This is what comes of fighting back," he muttered to the younger kitchen helper. "I seen this before, back when I was just a boy on the Harrison plantation. Some men tried to rise up, killed an overseer. You know what happened next? They hung 6 men, whipped the women, sold all the children. That's what rebellion gets you." He glanced nervously out the window toward the fields where Dinah worked. "That girl's going to get herself killed, looking at Hobbs like that. And for what? For a man who run off with a dog while we all suffer." When the day's work finally ended, Dinah dragged herself back to the quarters, her dress soaked with sweat, her back aching from hours bent over cotton plants. Hobbs had singled her out repeatedly, sensing her defiance. Once he'd pressed the whip handle under her chin, lifting her face to his. "Mr. Whitfield thinks you might know something about your friend and that dog," he'd whispered, his breath hot on her face. "Said I should keep an extra close eye on you." Now, in the dim light of the quarters, she collapsed onto her pallet, too exhausted even to wash the dirt from her face. Around her, others wept quietly from hunger and fear. Children whimpered, their stomachs empty. Later that night, when most had fallen into fitful sleep, a shadow moved outside the women's cabin. A gentle scratch at the loose board near the back wall made Dinah's eyes snap open. Heart pounding, she slipped from her pallet and crept to the sound. Pushing the board aside, she found herself staring into Zachariah's exhausted face. Brutus stood silent guard behind him, blending into the darkness. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered urgently, even as relief flooded through her. "The patrols—" "I had to know what's happening," he replied, his voice rough from thirst. "Are you all right?" "We're being starved," she said, glancing back to ensure no one had woken. "Whipped for the smallest things. Whitfield is like a man possessed." She reached back into the cabin and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "I saved this from my ration yesterday, before they cut us off completely." Inside was a small piece of cornbread, hard and dry. "It's not much." Zachariah took it gratefully, breaking off half for Brutus before eating his portion in 2 quick bites. "Listen to me," Dinah whispered, leaning closer. "Whitfield told Hobbs today that if you're not caught by tomorrow night, he'll start the executions. He's going to make examples, starting with the strongest men." Her voice dropped even lower. "You need to get far away from here. Head north. Don't come back." Zachariah's eyes, reflecting the faint moonlight, hardened. "I won't leave you all to die for what I did." "We'll die if you stay," she countered. "At least if you escape, someone is free." A sound from inside the cabin made them both freeze. Someone turning on their pallet, murmuring in sleep. "I have to go," Dinah whispered. "Please, be careful." Before she could withdraw, Zachariah caught her hand. "I'm not running," he said firmly. I came back to tell you. I have a plan." The resolve in his voice sent a chill down Dinah's spine, not of fear, but of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. "What plan?" she asked. A dog barked in the distance, a patrol returning from the swamp, and Brutus growled low in his throat. "No time now," Zachariah said, already backing away into the shadows. "But tell anyone you trust. Be ready. This plantation has seen its last overseer." Then he was gone, melting into the darkness with Brutus at his side, leaving Dinah staring after him, the impossible weight of his words settling around her like a cloak. Night wrapped around the plantation like a shroud, the moon occasionally peeking through clouds that promised rain by morning. Near the stables, hidden in the deep shadows cast by the wooden structure, Zachariah crouched with his back against the wall. Brutus lay beside him, ears perked and alert, his massive body tense and ready. The dog's breathing was steady, but his eyes never stopped scanning the darkness. Zachariah stroked the mastiff's head, feeling the raised scars where Grady's training had left permanent marks. "Easy now," he whispered. "She'll come." The day had been long, spent mostly submerged in murky swamp water as patrols combed the area with increasing desperation. Whitfield had doubled the reward for his capture, and Zachariah had watched from the safety of thick cypress roots as men with guns and dogs passed barely 20 feet from where he hid. A soft rustling sound made Brutus lift his head. Zachariah placed a steadying hand on the dog's back, listening intently. The footsteps were light, careful, not the heavy tread of patrollers. Dinah emerged from between two cabins, moving like a shadow herself. She glanced around nervously before hurrying to the stables. Zachariah clicked his tongue softly, the signal they had arranged, and she turned toward his hiding place. "You shouldn't keep coming back," she whispered as she knelt beside him. Her face was thinner than just days ago, the hunger already showing. "Hobbs watches me all day. He knows something." "Did anyone follow you?" Zachariah asked, scanning the darkness behind her. "No. I made sure." She settled closer, her shoulder touching his. "I have news. 2 men are willing to help. Isaiah and Samuel. They trust you. They remember how you stood up for Caleb." Zachariah nodded slowly. Isaiah was a blacksmith's helper, strong and steady. Samuel worked the cotton gin, knowing its mechanisms better than anyone. "Good men. Useful men. Can they meet tonight?" he asked. "They're waiting by the old oak past the tool shed," Dinah replied. "But Zachariah," her voice cracked slightly. "Whitfield wasn't bluffing. At sundown tomorrow he plans to hang Daniel and Josiah as examples. He says 2 more will follow each day until you're caught." Zachariah's jaw tightened. Daniel was barely 17. Josiah, a father of 3. Both were chosen for their strength, to frighten the others into submission. "Then we move tonight," he said, his voice low but firm. "I didn't come back to watch more people die." "What are you planning to do?" Dinah asked, fear and curiosity mingling in her voice. "Not run," Zachariah replied, meeting her eyes. "That's what they expect. They think I'm halfway to the next county by now. But running frees only 1 man." He leaned closer. "I'm going to break this place apart." He stood carefully, keeping to the shadows, and whistled softly for Brutus to follow. Together with Dinah, they made their way through the darkness toward the old oak. The massive tree stood like a sentinel, its lowest branches stretching out like welcoming arms. Beneath it, 2 figures waited. "Zachariah," Isaiah whispered, stepping forward. His powerful arms were crossed over his chest, his expression cautious but resolute. Beside him, Samuel nodded solemnly. "You're a brave fool to come back," Samuel said. "Or maybe just a fool." "Maybe," Zachariah agreed. "But I'm tired of watching brave men die while nothing changes." Brutus circled the small group, sniffing the air, his body a living perimeter alarm. The 4 huddled close, speaking in hushed tones. Whitfield's wealth is in three things, Zachariah explained: cotton, tools, and us. We can't free everyone tonight, but we can destroy the other two. He outlined his plan quickly. Samuel would tamper with the cotton gin's mechanisms, not obviously, but enough to cause a catastrophic breakdown when run at full speed. Isaiah knew where the tools were stored and how to sabotage wagon axles so they would break when loaded. "And the cotton?" Dinah asked. "Fire," Zachariah said simply. "The storage shed has 3 weeks' harvest waiting for transport. Without it, Whitfield misses his contract with the buyers." Isaiah shook his head. "They'll know it was us. The reprisals will come whether we act or not," Zachariah finished. "Daniel and Josiah hang tomorrow regardless. This way, at least Whitfield bleeds too." A tense silence fell over the group. In the distance, a patroller's lantern swung as he made his rounds near the main house. "What about the dog?" Samuel asked, eyeing Brutus warily. "He's as recognizable as you are." "Brutus stays with me," Zachariah said. "If we're cornered, he'll buy us time." They spoke for several more minutes, planning each step carefully. When to move, where to meet afterward, how to create alibis for those who stayed behind. As they finished, a soft rustling from behind the tool shed made them all freeze. Brutus growled low in his throat, turning toward the sound. Zachariah signaled for silence, then crept forward, the dog at his side. Behind the shed, a figure turned to flee, but Brutus lunged, catching a sleeve in his teeth. "Please," a voice gasped. "Don't let it kill me." Zachariah pulled the struggling figure into the moonlight. Jonas, the cook, his eyes wide with terror. "What are you doing here, Jonas?" Zachariah demanded, keeping his voice low but hard. I was just getting air," Jonas stammered. "Couldn't sleep with the children crying from hunger." "How much did you hear?" Isaiah asked, stepping forward threateningly. Jonas looked between them, swallowing hard. "Enough," he admitted, "but I won't say nothing. I swear it." Dinah moved closer. "Jonas, you know what happens tomorrow if we do nothing. And you know what happens to all of us if you burn this place," Jonas hissed. "My children are here, Dinah. My wife. You think Whitfield won't kill every last one of us if his cotton burns?" "He needs us alive to rebuild," Zachariah countered. "That's our protection." Jonas shook his head, eyes darting to each face. "You're dreaming, Zachariah. This ain't freedom you're making. It's a grave for all of us." He looked at Brutus, still holding his sleeve. "Call off your devil dog. I told you, I won't speak of this." Zachariah studied the man's face, seeing the fear there, not just for himself, but for his family. Slowly, he signaled Brutus to release him. "Go back to your cabin, Jonas," he said quietly. "Tend to your children. Tomorrow night, keep them inside, away from the sheds." Jonas backed away, rubbing his arm where Brutus had held him. "You're going to get us all killed," he whispered. But there was doubt in his voice now, not just fear. After Jonas disappeared into the darkness, Samuel turned to Zachariah. "Can we trust him?" "We have no choice," Zachariah replied. "Dawn's coming soon. We need to move." They separated quickly, each to their assigned tasks. Dinah lingered last, her hand finding Zachariah's in the darkness. "Be careful," she whispered. "Hobbs has men watching the swamp edge. We'll be waiting at the old cypress when it's done," he assured her. Before she could leave, he added, "Dinah, the fire we light tomorrow must burn more than cotton." "What do you mean?" she asked. "It needs to burn the fear out of us," he said, his voice intense. "All of us. Or nothing changes." She nodded slowly, understanding flowing between them without more words. Then she was gone, slipping back toward the quarters. Zachariah whistled softly, and Brutus fell in beside him as they melted back into the pre-dawn darkness, making their way toward the swamp that had become their temporary sanctuary. Behind them, the plantation slept, unaware that its foundations were already beginning to crumble. The following evening crept over the plantation like a stalking predator. Dark clouds hung low, pregnant with coming rain, the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Heat lightning flashed silently in the distance, briefly illuminating the fields and buildings in stark relief before plunging them back into shadow. Zachariah watched from the edge of the swamp as lanterns were lit in the quarters. From his vantage point, the movement of people seemed normal. Women hanging washing, men trudging back from the fields, children being called in for the night. But his trained eye caught the small signs others would miss. A red cloth hanging where there should be white. A lantern placed in a window facing the wrong direction. Quick glances toward the tree line where he hid. Signals, preparations, the rebellion brewing beneath the routine. Brutus panted beside him, sensing his tension. The dog's ears perked at every sound. His massive body coiled like a spring. "Almost time, boy," Zachariah whispered, patting the dog's scarred head. The first stars were beginning to appear in the patches of clear sky between storm clouds. When full darkness fell, Zachariah made his move. He slipped from shadow to shadow with Brutus at his heels, crossing the open ground between swamp and outbuildings in short, careful dashes. At the edge of the cotton gin, he paused, giving a low whistle that mimicked a whippoorwill's call. Samuel emerged from behind the building, his face gleaming with sweat. "It's done," he whispered. "Weak point in the main axle. Won't last 10 minutes at full speed tomorrow." Zachariah nodded. "Isaiah?" "Finished the wagons an hour ago. Filed the axles thin. They'll break as soon as they're loaded." Samuel glanced nervously at the main house. "The others are ready too, just waiting for your signal." Zachariah scanned the yard. Guards patrolled lazily, made complacent by routine. They expected trouble from outside, not within. "Tell them midnight," Zachariah said, "when the storm front hits." Samuel disappeared back into the darkness. Zachariah counted minutes by his heartbeat, watching the clouds roll closer, feeling the changing pressure in the air. Brutus grew increasingly alert, sensing what was coming. At the quarters, lights dimmed one by one until only a few windows glowed. The guards gathered near the cookhouse for their midnight meal, their voices carrying across the yard. Jonas would be serving them, his face carefully blank as he filled their plates, listening to their talk while memorizing their positions. Unless fear had already turned him. The first crack of thunder seemed to split the sky. Zachariah tensed, counting 1, 2, 3, and then he nodded to Brutus. The dog shot forward, a dark shadow moving toward the tool shed where Isaiah waited. The coordinated attack unfolded like clockwork. Isaiah and 3 other men silently pushed the sabotaged wagons from their shelter, directing them toward the downward slope that led to the pond. Gathering speed, the wagons crashed into each other with splintering force, the noise masked by another thunderclap. At the cotton gin, Samuel opened the side doors while 2 others passed forward burlap sacks soaked in lamp oil. They worked methodically, placing them near wooden supports and machinery parts. Zachariah himself moved toward the storage shed, where 3 weeks' worth of picked cotton waited for transport. The white bowls gleamed faintly in the darkness, like ghostly heads watching his approach. He carried a small flask of oil and a wrapped torch. A guard rounded the corner unexpectedly, lantern raised. "Who's there?" Zachariah froze, but Brutus didn't. The massive dog launched forward with a growl that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. The guard barely had time to shout before Brutus slammed into his chest, sending him sprawling. The lantern shattered, oil spilling across the packed dirt. The shout alerted the other guards. Lanterns bobbed as they ran toward the commotion. But by then, it was too late. Zachariah struck his flint. The first torch blazed to life, and he touched it to the oil-soaked cotton. The fire caught with a hungry whoosh, spreading faster than thought. Across the yard, similar flames erupted from the gin house and other buildings. For one glorious moment, Zachariah stood watching as orange flames climbed skyward, illuminating the faces of enslaved people who had emerged from their cabins. In their eyes, he saw something he'd never seen before. Not just fear, but wonder, power, the realization that they were not helpless. "Burn!" someone shouted from the darkness, the voice unrecognizable with emotion. "Burn it all down!" The flames roared higher, feeding on dry wood and cotton, creating their own wind. Sparks flew upward to meet the lightning. The guards ran in confusion, some trying to organize a bucket line, others firing blindly into the darkness. Brutus stood at Zachariah's side, teeth bared at anyone who came close. Together they circled toward the quarters where Dinah waited with the others who planned to flee tonight. But something was wrong. The path to the meeting point was empty. Zachariah paused, uncertain, feeling the first drops of rain on his face as the storm finally broke overhead. Movement near the main house caught his eye. Jonas, running up the steps to the front door, pounding urgently. The door opened, spilling yellow lamplight onto the porch. Whitfield's tall figure appeared, listening as Jonas pointed toward the fires, then toward the quarters. "No," Zachariah breathed, the triumph draining from him. The betrayal happened fast. Whitfield shouted orders, and armed men who had been waiting inside poured out, heading not toward the fires, but toward the quarters. They knew. They had been prepared. Rain began to fall in earnest, but it was too late to douse the fires that now engulfed half the plantation's buildings. Too late to stop what Jonas had set in motion. Zachariah ran for the quarters, Brutus loping beside him. He had to reach Dinah, had to warn the others, but the armed men got there first. By the time Zachariah reached the edge of the slave cabins, patrols were already dragging people out into the rain. Women screamed, children cried, men struggled against rifles pressed to their backs. From his hiding place in the shadows, Zachariah watched in horror as Dinah was pulled from her cabin, her arms twisted behind her. Her eyes swept the darkness as if searching for him, her face set in defiant lines despite her fear. "This one," Whitfield said, pointing at her as rain streamed down his face. "She'll talk. Take her to the house." 2 men dragged her away, her bare feet leaving tracks in the mud. Others continued the search, pushing through cabins, overturning beds, looking for conspirators. Dawn was approaching, the faint grayness visible through the storm clouds. The fires still smoldered despite the rain, sending plumes of black smoke into the lightening sky. But the brief flame of rebellion was being extinguished by gun barrels and whips. Zachariah crouched in the shadows, rage and despair warring in his chest. Brutus pressed against him, sensing his anguish. They could not fight these numbers, not directly. But Dinah was being taken, and with her, hope itself seemed to be slipping away. The rain fell harder, soaking through his clothes, but Zachariah barely felt it. All he saw was Dinah's face as they took her, the trust in her eyes even as they dragged her toward the big house, trust that he would find a way. Noon sun filtered weakly through the cypress trees, casting dappled light across the swamp water. Zachariah lay on a small island of relatively dry ground, his back pressed against a fallen log. His clothes were still damp from the morning's rain, clinging uncomfortably to his skin. Beside him, Brutus panted heavily, his massive head resting on his paws. The dog's right flank bore an angry red gash where a bullet had grazed him during their escape from the plantation. Zachariah had washed it as best he could with swamp water and bound it with a strip torn from his shirt. But the wound was clearly causing Brutus pain. "Easy, boy," Zachariah murmured, resting a hand on the dog's head. His own body ached from exhaustion and hunger. They'd been unable to take food in their hasty retreat, and the few berries he'd found weren't enough to satisfy either of them. A rustle in the undergrowth sent Brutus's head up, a low growl building in his throat. Zachariah tensed, reaching for the sharpened stick he'd fashioned into a makeshift spear. "Zachariah?" The whisper came hesitantly. "It's me, Isaiah." Zachariah relaxed slightly, but kept the spear ready. "Come forward slow." Isaiah emerged from the cypress knees, his clothes torn and muddy. His face was scratched, and a bruise darkened one eye. He held up empty hands to show he carried no weapon. "They beat me, but I got away," Isaiah said, voice trembling. "I ran soon as I saw what was happening. Ain't nobody following me, I made sure." "What happened after I left?" Zachariah asked, motioning for the man to sit. Isaiah sank down onto the damp ground, his legs seemingly unable to hold him any longer. "It's bad, Zachariah. Real bad. They got Dinah locked up in the storage cellar under the big house. Whitfield's saying she'll hang at sunset tomorrow unless you turn yourself in." Zachariah's heart seemed to stop in his chest. "And the others? Some got whipped till they couldn't stand. Samuel's foot got shot. They working everybody double now, even the children." Isaiah swallowed hard. "And Jonas told them everything. Told them you been planning it all, that you turned the dog against Grady, that you got people helping you. Jonas." The name tasted like poison on Zachariah's tongue. "He was scared for his kids," Isaiah said, though his tone made it clear he wasn't defending the betrayal. Whitfield promised him special treatment if he talked. Now he's staying in the overseer's old cabin, eating at the big house. Rage burned through Zachariah, so hot and sudden it momentarily blinded him. He gripped the spear until his knuckles turned white, imagining driving it through Jonas's treacherous heart. Brutus whined softly, sensing his fury. "They got patrols searching everywhere," Isaiah continued. "Dogs, guns, everything. But they mostly looking north, thinking you'd head for free territory." Zachariah nodded slowly. That made sense, and it meant the swamp might remain relatively safe for a little longer. "You need to know something else," Isaiah said, his voice dropping even lower. "They saying if they don't find you by sunset tomorrow, they gonna hang Dinah and one other person every day until you show yourself." The words hit Zachariah like physical blows. He closed his eyes, seeing Dinah's face, her quiet strength, her gentle hands tending his wounds, her eyes that never wavered when others looked away in fear. "Go back," he said finally. "Tell them I'm heading north. Tell them you spotted me near the county line." Isaiah looked alarmed. "But that'll send them right after you." "No," Zachariah said. "It'll send them away from where I'll actually be." Understanding dawned in Isaiah's eyes. "You going back for her?" It wasn't a question, but Zachariah nodded anyway. "I can't leave her to die for helping me." "It's suicide," Isaiah whispered. "The place is crawling with armed men now. Then I die fighting instead of running." Zachariah's voice was flat, final. "Go now. Be careful getting back." Isaiah hesitated, then nodded. "God be with you, Zachariah." He slipped back into the undergrowth, leaving Zachariah alone with Brutus and his thoughts. For a long time, Zachariah sat motionless, despair and rage warring within him. He could run, head west instead of north, maybe find his way to the territories where a man might lose himself. Brutus would follow him, loyal to the end. They might even survive. But Dinah would hang, and after her, others. All because they had dared to hope, had dared to help him. Brutus nudged his hand with a wet nose, eyes questioning. Despite his wound, the dog's gaze held steady, trusting. "We ain't running," Zachariah told him, scratching behind his ears. "But we ain't dying easy either." He pushed himself to his feet, wincing at the stiffness in his muscles. The swamp stretched around them, mysterious and dangerous to those who didn't understand its ways. But Zachariah had spent years watching animals, learning their habits, their instincts. He knew this land better than any patrol. "Come on, boy," he said to Brutus. "We got work to do." The afternoon passed in careful, methodical labor. Zachariah waded through shallow water, searching for quicksand bogs where the bottom dropped away without warning. He marked safe paths with broken reeds and set traps along the false ones, trip lines made from vines, hidden pits covered with branches and leaves. At one promising location, where an innocent-looking mud flat concealed a deep sinkhole, Zachariah carefully constructed a false trail leading directly to the trap. He broke branches at shoulder height, disturbed the moss on tree trunks, left partial footprints in visible mud. All the signs an experienced tracker would follow. Brutus watched from firm ground, occasionally growling at sounds in the distance. The dog's wound had stopped bleeding, but he moved with a noticeable limp. "Just a little longer," Zachariah promised him, wiping sweat from his brow. The sun was beginning its descent, shadows lengthening across the water. His hands worked steadily, even as his mind raced. The traps would slow the patrols, maybe even claim a few, but they wouldn't be enough. He needed to get to the plantation, to find Dinah before sunset tomorrow. And for that, he needed a diversion. The answer came to him as he was setting his final snare. A loop of twisted vine hidden in tall grass beside a seemingly solid patch of ground that was actually a deep bog. The master's prized tobacco fields lay at the northeastern edge of the plantation, far from the main house and slave quarters. If those fields burned, every available man would rush to save them. By the time Zachariah finished setting the trap, night was falling. Insects buzzed in clouds around him, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called. He sank down beside Brutus, exhaustion finally claiming him. The dog pressed against his side, offering warmth in the cooling air. Despite his wound, Brutus remained alert, his ears swiveling at every sound, his body tense and ready. "We ain't dying in this swamp," Zachariah whispered, burying his fingers in the dog's coarse fur. "We ain't dying hiding like scared rabbits. If we die fighting, and we take as many of them with us as we can." Brutus growled softly, as if in agreement. In the growing darkness, his eyes reflected what little light remained, steady, unafraid, and utterly loyal. Dawn broke with a thin, watery light that barely penetrated the morning mist hanging over the plantation. In the main yard, slaves were being herded into rows by armed men. Their faces were drawn with exhaustion and fear as they shuffled into place, forming a grim audience for what was to come. Whitfield stood on the porch of the big house, watching the preparations with cold eyes. He wore his Sunday coat despite the heat, as if to mark the occasion as something formal and righteous. Behind him, the new overseer, a squat, red-faced man named Hobbs, barked orders at the house servants. "Bring her out," Whitfield commanded, his voice carrying across the silent yard. Two men disappeared into the cellar beneath the house. Moments later, they emerged, dragging Dinah between them. Her dress was torn and dirty, her face bruised, but she walked with her head high. They marched her toward the oak tree at the center of the yard, where a rope hung from a sturdy branch. Jonas stood apart from the other slaves, closer to the white men. His eyes were fixed on the ground, unable to meet the accusing stares of those he had lived alongside for years. Occasionally, he glanced at his children, huddled together in the front row, as if seeking justification in their frightened faces. "Let this be a lesson," Whitfield announced, stepping down from the porch. "Defiance brings only death. After this woman, another will hang tomorrow, and another the day after, until the dog-man is caught, or every conspirator is punished." The crowd remained silent, though a current of tension ran through them. Some looked at Jonas with naked hatred, others kept their eyes carefully blank, showing nothing. Beyond the cleared land surrounding the plantation, in the tangled edges of the swamp, Zachariah lay flat on his stomach, watching. Mud and crushed leaves covered his skin and clothes, disguising his scent and breaking up his outline. Beside him, Brutus waited, his massive body similarly camouflaged, only his amber eyes alert and moving. From his hiding place, Zachariah could see 2 patrols had already fallen victim to his traps. In the distance, men shouted as they struggled to pull a companion from quicksand. Closer to the edge of the property, another group had scattered. When they disturbed a water moccasin nest, Zachariah had carefully herded into their path. Now most of the remaining guards were gathered for the execution, just as he had hoped. At the oak tree, one of the men roughly pushed Dinah up onto a wooden barrel. She stumbled, but didn't fall. Her hands were bound behind her back, making it hard for her to balance. "I'll ask one more time," Whitfield said, approaching her. "Where is Zachariah hiding?" Dinah looked down at him, her face calm despite the rope being fitted around her neck. "I don't know," she said, her voice clear enough to carry across the yard. "And if I did, I wouldn't tell you." Whitfield's mouth tightened. "Then you die for nothing." He turned to Hobbs. "Proceed." Zachariah tensed, readying himself. He touched Brutus lightly, signaling the dog to stay, then began crawling backward, away from his observation point. Once clear, he moved in a low crouch through the tall grass toward the tobacco fields. The fields were empty, everyone having been called to witness the execution. Zachariah moved quickly, using a flint to strike sparks into the dry tobacco leaves. The morning dew had already burned off in the rising heat, and the plants caught fire easily. Within moments, flames began to spread along the neat rows. Back in the yard, Hobbs was reaching for the barrel under Dinah's feet when a shout went up from the direction of the fields. "Fire! The tobacco's burning!" Whitfield whirled around, his face contorting with rage and alarm. "Put it out!" he bellowed. "Hobbs, take men, and put it out now!" The execution paused as half the armed men ran toward the blazing fields. Smoke rose in thick plumes, black against the morning sky. The slaves stirred uneasily, sensing the disruption of routine, the opening of possibility. This was the moment Zachariah had been waiting for. He whistled sharply, the signal for Brutus, then burst from hiding at the edge of the yard, moving with startling speed for the oak tree. Screams and shouts erupted. The remaining guards fumbled for their weapons, but Zachariah was already among them, a whirlwind of desperate strength. He knocked the first man down with a shoulder charge, seized his rifle, and swung it like a club at the second. Brutus emerged from another direction, limping but terrible in his ferocity. His jaws clamped around the arm of a guard about to shoot Zachariah, and the man screamed, his shot going wild. Chaos engulfed the yard. Some slaves scattered. Others, seeing their chance, joined the fight, grabbing stones, tools, anything that could serve as a weapon. Zachariah reached the oak tree, leaping onto the barrel beside Dinah. With one swift movement, he pulled the noose from her neck and sliced the ropes binding her hands using a knife he'd hidden in his belt. "Run!" he shouted in her ear as he helped her down. Dinah gripped his arm. "Not without you." Whitfield, seeing his authority collapsing around him, drew a pistol from his coat. "Kill them!" he roared, aiming at Zachariah. "Kill them all!" But before he could fire, a figure lunged at him from the side. Jonas. The cook's face was twisted with anguish and resolve as he drove a kitchen knife deep into Whitfield's side. "My children," Jonas gasped, his eyes meeting Zachariah's across the yard. "Take them too." The words had barely left his lips when one of the remaining guards fired. Jonas staggered, a red stain blooming across his chest, then collapsed to the ground. Whitfield fell to his knees, clutching his bleeding side, his face a mask of disbelief. The pistol dropped from his fingers. Brutus bounded forward, ignoring his wounds, and stood over the fallen master, teeth bared in a snarl that dared anyone to approach. Blood matted the dog's coat, but his eyes burned with fierce protection. Zachariah pulled Dinah close as more fires broke out. Slaves were setting torch to wagons, barns, anything that would burn. The smoke rose higher, blotting out the sun, while around them More and more of the enslaved seized their moment to flee. Fire swept through the plantation with hungry fury. What had begun as controlled burns in the tobacco fields now raged unchecked, leaping from the dry cotton stores to the wooden barns and outbuildings. The flames reached greedy fingers toward the big house, catching first on the curtains visible through open windows, then devouring the porch where Whitfield had stood so proudly just minutes before. The yard had transformed into chaos. Enslaved men and women moved in all directions, some fleeing toward the woods, others standing frozen, watching with wide eyes as their prison burned. The remaining guards had abandoned their posts, more concerned with saving their own lives than capturing runaways. Through the thickening smoke, Zachariah kept his grip on Dinah's hand. Blood trickled from a cut above his eye, but his gaze remained clear and determined. Brutus stayed close to his side, the massive dog's fur singed in places, his movements stiff but purposeful. "Jonas's children!" Dinah shouted above the roar of the fire, pointing toward two small figures huddled against the cookhouse wall. "We need to get them!" Zachariah nodded and changed direction. As they neared the cookhouse, more people joined them. 3 field workers, a young woman from the laundry, an older man who'd worked the stables alongside Zachariah. Without words, they formed a group, instinctively staying together for protection. When they reached the children, the boy, no more than 8, clung to his younger sister, his face streaked with tears and soot. "Your father sent us," Zachariah said, crouching down. "Come with us now." The boy looked past him toward where Jonas's body lay sprawled in the dirt, and his face crumpled. But he stood, pulling his sister up with him. "We need to move through the eastern fields," Zachariah told the group, his voice low but carrying. "The fire's thinner there, and it leads straight to the swamp. Stay low. Stay together." Across the yard, Whitfield still knelt where Jonas had stabbed him, one hand pressed to his bleeding side. His face had gone gray, his eyes wide with disbelief, as he watched his property, his world, burn around him. 2 house servants had tried to help him to his feet, but he'd waved them away, shouting orders that no one followed anymore. As Zachariah's group began moving toward the eastern fields, Whitfield spotted them. With a final surge of fury, he staggered to his feet, retrieving his fallen pistol. "Stop them!" he bellowed, though no one remained to obey. He raised the pistol with a shaking hand. The shot cracked above the fire's roar. One of the field workers cried out, stumbling, but his companions caught him before he fell. Whitfield tried to aim again, but his strength was fading with his blood. Brutus growled, turning back toward the threat. But Zachariah called him forward. "Leave him," he commanded. "The fire will finish what Jonas started." They hurried on, supporting the wounded man between them. Behind them, the big house's roof caught fire with a whoosh that sent sparks spiraling into the sky. A support beam crashed down, and screams rose from inside. Whitfield's family, or remaining servants, impossible to tell. The heat pressed against their backs as they reached the edge of the cotton fields. The fire hadn't spread here yet, but smoke rolled across the ground like fog, making it hard to see and breathe. Dinah tore strips from her skirt, soaking them in a water trough before passing them out to cover mouths and noses. Jonas's little girl began to cough, her eyes streaming. Without hesitation, Zachariah lifted her onto his shoulders. "Hold tight," he told her. "Not much farther now." They moved as quickly as they could through the rows of cotton, the plants still unburned but tainted by smoke. Behind them, more explosions rocked the main buildings as barrels of lamp oil and whiskey caught fire. The sound of the plantation's death throes followed them like angry ghosts. At the edge of the swamp, they paused to look back. The entire western sky seemed aflame, the buildings now just black silhouettes against an orange-red backdrop. Where Whitfield had fallen, there was now only fire. Jonas's body lay where it had fallen, but the flames were approaching quickly. Soon, the betrayer-turned-savior would be indistinguishable from the ashes of the world he'd both preserved and helped destroy. "He saved us in the end," Dinah murmured, looking back at the burning yard. "Fear made him betray us," Zachariah answered, his voice heavy. "Love made him save us. Remember him for the latter." The swamp welcomed them with its familiar darkness and damp embrace. Zachariah led them along paths only he knew, avoiding the quicksand and snake nests he'd used to trap the patrols. Brutus limped ahead, occasionally stopping to sniff the air, then continuing with confident steps despite his injuries. They traveled through the night, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and what remained of the plantation. The wounded man grew weaker, but they fashioned a stretcher from branches and cloth, refusing to leave him behind. As the first gray light of dawn touched the eastern sky, they reached the far edge of the swamp. Exhausted, mud-covered, and smoke-stained, they climbed a small ridge and stopped to rest. From this vantage point, they could see back the way they had come. The plantation was now just a smoldering ruin on the horizon, thin tendrils of smoke still rising into the clearing sky. The fields that had once been ordered rows of green and white were blackened scars on the land. Zachariah stood silently, Jonas's daughter still on his shoulders, her small hands gripping his hair as she slept from exhaustion. Brutus settled beside him, panting heavily but alert, his scarred body somehow dignified in the morning light. Among the ashes of the distant yard, something glinted in the first rays of sun. Chains, whips, the metal collars and tools of bondage rendered useless in the destruction. "What now?" asked the stableman, his voice rough from smoke. Zachariah looked at the faces around him, afraid but alive, uncertain but free. He shifted the sleeping child more comfortably on his shoulders and reached down to touch Brutus's head gently. "North," he said simply. "We go north." Without another word, he turned away from the ruins. The others followed, moving into the uncertain horizon where the sun was just beginning to rise. Behind them lay the ashes of their past. Ahead, a future without chains. Brutus limped at Zachariah's side, the overseer's weapon transformed into the runaway's protector. Like them, he bore scars that would never fully heal. But like them, he walked with a freedom that made the pain worthwhile. The small band disappeared into the trees, leaving no trace of their passing. The world they had known was gone, burned away in a night of fire and blood. What lay ahead was unknown, dangerous, precarious, but their own to shape at last. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.